Hey everyone, and welcome to a very special panel part of Seattle Pride. I'm Matt Baum. I'm a writer and pop culture critic based here in Seattle. And today we're going to be looking at objects that are part of MoPOP's exhibit, Rise Up, Stonewall and the LGBTQ Rights Movement, a chronicle of the pop culture, politics, challenges, victories of the queer liberation movement. It's presented in partnership with the Freedom Forum. We have some amazing histories, some good, some bad, some in between. And we also have a panel of queer culture experts. We're going to be discussing the ways that the history embodied in these objects has impacted our lives in the past and still impacts our lives to this day. And our panelists have no idea what objects they're going to be looking at. So we're going to be seeing their reactions as it happens. So I'd like to welcome our esteemed panel. We have Isabella Price, a filmmaker, writer, costume designer, podcast host, burlesque performer, horror film expert. Isabella, thanks so much for being here.
No problem. No problem. Thank you for having me.
We also have Devlyn Camp, the host of the podcast Queer Serial, bringing queer history to life. It is a thrill to be joined by you.
Thanks for having me. I'm very excited.
And Kristin Russo, writer and educator, host of Buffering the Vampire Slayer podcast, founder of My Kid is Gay. It is a delight to see you.
Delight to see you as well.
Yay. Well, with no further ado, let's jump right into the images and let's put our first one up on screen. So here we have, this is one of the first rainbow flags. It was created by Gilbert Baker in San Francisco in the 70s. It was actually at the behest of Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk challenged Gilbert to come up with an image that could represent the community. Until then, it was frequently the pink triangle, which was something that was used in concentration camps and had a pretty heavy, dark past associated with it. So Harvey challenged Gilbert to come up with something more uplifting. And this is what he created. You can see there's the color arrangement is a little different than what we have today. But that was one of the very first rainbow flags to have flown. So I just want to get like panel's first reaction to seeing this. What does it feel like to see the very first rainbow, or one of the first rainbow flags?
It's gorgeous. You know?
Oh, sorry. You go ahead.
No. No, I mean, yeah, it's like when you see like one of the first like American flags, you know, it's just so to be able to see it, even though when I first saw it, I was like, what's missing in this one? This was a little different. It's really awesome to see. And I understand it makes you feel good, you know, understanding that you need to have something that's a little bit more optimistic, and the rainbow makes you feel good. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say it feels retro. Like you put that wonderfully. Like it's one of the first American flags. It feels retro to see just the vertical stripes rather than, I'm so used to now seeing the progress flag with the trans flag and the black and brown stripes worked in. So it's like, oh, a throwback. Wow.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think, you know, it's like a symbol of the way in which I think communities initially were coming together at that time, you know, and like you can feel that. Like the first thing that I noticed on this is this, like the stitching, and just thinking about like who did that, like who stitched these pieces together. So it's really beautiful to think about that time in history and where we are now, right? Because I think everyone in this group thought the same thing. Like we're all very much flying the flag with the brown and black and trans triangle in the corner, but this is definitely the origin, and it's really cool.
There's a great story about Gilbert making this flag by hand. Like in the beginning, it was just him sewing in his apartment late at night and dyeing all of the fabric in his washing machine. You know, like it was really a handmade thing. And I'd love to hear from you all. Like, have there been times when you've displayed the flag, or like, do you remember your first rainbow flag, or times that it's affected you?
Yeah, I remember my first one. I think I got it from Spencer's Gifts, and I hung it up. I lived for a long time in Texas, and so that was like a real, you know, FU to hang up the rainbow flag outside of your apartment window. And so I hung it up, I think, in my dorm room, and that was kind of the first. I remember seeing it as I was like walking home, you know, maybe drunk, who knows, and just seeing that one window that has the rainbow flag hanging out of it and being like, that's that's me. So yeah, I it still brings me joy. Yeah.
I was about to tell Spencer's gift story too.
They were
I don't have a Spencer gift story.
They were Chronicle. They were so rough back in the day. Back in the day.
It's like all the little rainbow knickknacks. And I got a t-shirt there with it had like the male bathroom symbol, which now also seems outdated, but it's like the two little male bathroom symbols side by side, and they were all different rainbow colors. And I wore it to school on the first day of my sophomore year because everyone already heard I was gay, and I was like, rainbow.
Oh, I never got a rainbow flag at Spencer Gifts. I'm so upset with myself.
Not too late.
Yeah, but I mean, I think for me, I associate it mostly with moving to New York City. I was out like in the beginning of college, but I wasn't like rainbow flag out until I moved to the city. And so like my first few early 20s, like me being in my early 20s going to Pride, I would just be like literally covered in rainbows, you know, like that's what I see most when I think back to my memory of a rainbow.
My association with the rainbow, my first was a necklace with little interlocking rainbow rings that I got at the kiosk outside of a Spencer's gift. It's literally at the mall. Like, I don't know why we all have, like, this was like the Rainbow Depot apparently. But yeah, it was a little rainbow interlocking links on the necklace. And it was very controversial that like somebody was wearing like in high school that somebody, oh, he's got a rainbow. Everybody's got talking about the rainbow necklace. Does it mean something? Oh, here's what it means. And you know, it's got this sort of the innocuous, who could be opposed to a rainbow aspect that you can blend in a little bit if you need to. There's some plausible deniability there where it's not quite like the pink triangle or the lambda symbol or I don't know. There's so many other miscellaneous symbols and ways of signifying that you're a part of this, part of a subculture. And the rainbow, you know, has a really nice optimism.
Well, I remember that in school, like, you know, the first time that kids were like, you're wearing rainbow? Don't you know what that means? You're wearing the rainbow. Do you know what they say about people who wear rainbows? You know, and it was this whole thing of being like kid and being like, oh, I just love rainbows and not really knowing what exactly it meant. And then when it kind of turned into this whole thing of like wearing rainbows means you're gay, and then being like, cool, great. So then we're gonna keep wearing rainbows. Like, you know, the idea of when that first started hitting in pop culture and how it became coded, but it was invisible but coded, and if you knew, you knew, and this great way of kind of communicating with other people that like we knew, and not necessarily everyone knew exactly if you wore a rainbow then that meant that you were gay. It's still kind of the same thing. Like if you wear rainbows, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're queer, but you can kind of sense a little signal, you know. I'm kind of looking at you, you know. So I feel like that's the great thing about the rainbow, is that it's innocuous, but it's there. It's symbolic, invisible, but highly visible at the same time. So yeah.
I had such a different experience with rainbows. Like in my mind, like the rainbow, like putting a rainbow on my body was as blatant as I could get, you know, like it made me the most nervous. Like, you know, wearing like Converse sneakers or like zip up hoodies or, you know, a Tegan and Sarah t-shirt or like there were like other things that like I found like, oh, well, maybe, you know, but the rainbow felt so like I felt so visible with rainbows at that time.
I'm just curious, question for everybody. Do you have symbols that you wear today? Like, do you still wear a rainbow? Is there something else that you put on your body or your car or whatever?
I think that the biggest one for me is the Black Lives Matter, BLM. That feels as dangerous as maybe wearing rainbow before. You know, this idea that if I'm wearing BLM anything, and I, you know, go back home to visit my family, or if I'm just at the wrong place at the wrong time, or just standing at the grocery store, is somebody going to, you know, like do something to me? And that feels like a very purposeful thing to wear something that says BLM. You know what it means, and you know what I mean when I'm wearing that. And so it also feels very risky at the same time. Yeah.
Similarly, I got a T-shirt of a bunch of children. It's an animated T-shirt of a bunch of children of different nations holding hands around a burning cop car. And I know I gotta be really choosy about where I go out wearing that. You know, I'm from Indiana, so I relate to you there.
Drop the link. Let me know where that is. I want to know they have my hat.
It's a great shirt.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of like jumping off of what you're both talking about at this point, but I will say that I live in a house by myself for the first time, and I'm not in New York City. I was in New York City for like 20 years. I'm in upstate New York, and I just moved into this house in December, and like the sun is out, the grass is growing, and I'm planning to put Black Lives Matter like flag in front of my house. But the feeling that it brings is that like, it's like, I know that this is what I believe, and I know that this is important, but also like it does feel vulnerable in a way that Isabella, I agree. It's like how it felt to wear a rainbow a while back. Yeah.
Well, so on the topic of activism and putting a stake in the ground, let's take a look at our second image. We can get that up on screen. So this is the cover of the ACT UP newsletter, 1988 in Los Angeles, art there by Bradley Rader. So ACT UP, as I'm sure a lot of folks know, was a really pivotal organization during the early and into the later days of the epidemic. Coming out of a history of really confrontational, disruptive zaps and protests where it wasn't enough just to make your voice heard, but you really had to get in people's faces and make basically stop the presses and make people pay attention to you. Silence equals death was one of the big prominent slogans that came out of ACT UP. So they would do die-ins on Wall Street where they would disrupt the traffic and just, put chalk outlines around the people there to symbolize the lives that have been lost. They shut down the FDA on one occasion, a huge action. And it was a real change from tactics of decades past that were much more about respectability and fitting in and not challenging people too much. And of course, one of their big targets back in the 80s was Dr. Fauci. He was one of the people who was a pivotal force at the FDA. And when ACT UP confronted him, he listened, he invited them in, and we see it today with him continuing to do work around pandemics. So one of the questions I want to put to you all is an organization like ACT UP with their tactics, getting in people's faces and really shouting at people until they were listened to, it just made them impossible to ignore. What do you feel is the right balance of working within the system and making allies, forming allies and getting along versus being confrontational and working outside the system and demanding change?
Super light question, Matt.
Yeah, I know.
We've learned so much about modern activism because of groups like this, especially like this, because there have been so many times when people have protested in the last century when no one would listen, and they made people listen when it counted the most. Like one of my favorite ACT UP protests, or one of my favorite actions of theirs was when there was a senator that was trying to defund HIV care. And so when he wasn't home, when his family wasn't home, this small group of ACT UP members went to his house and put a giant condom over his house and brought the news out at the crack of dawn to make sure it was captured before the police came. And it was a huge undertaking, but because it was so funny, it made huge headlines. And they taught us how to make a joke out of it. And that's the way we've got to do it if no one's going to listen.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that, the difference is that now you can't just tweet at somebody and say, like, how do you feel about this? Like you had to be more drastic about things. And so often when we talk about protesting, there's always this kind of group of people who are like, I agree with your message. I just wish that you didn't like go out and stop traffic and interrupt me and things like that. And it's like, well, what is the purpose of a protest if not to disrupt things and to make you think about things, And like this idea that we often forget when we talk about the AIDS crisis is how much silence there was, how many people did not even talk about it. We're not even talking about the people whose lives were being lost constantly. And the silence was deafening, you know? And it's like I said, it's not like now where it's like, why aren't you tweeting about this? Why aren't you putting up an Instagram iconographic about this? Like, people just did not even speak about it. And it was horrific, you know? And so I think that ACT UP, I'm constantly inspired by, I call them antics, because they were antics. They were wild. Some of the time, you know, they got out of hand. Some of the time, I didn't think they went far enough. Like, to me, that's so inspirational. We just had a whole year of just the most intense protests that I've ever been in. And the entire time I was thinking about the ACT UP. I was thinking, like, this is, the world is watching, and they're going to be watching our actions now. And the ACT UP participants had so much to lose. They had everything to lose. And to me, that's so inspirational. And I think it's great. I think their work is historic, you know, for the whole world.
Yeah, I think that I first learned of ACT UP, you know, I came out in 98, and I think that, like, coming out in the late 90s, you were sort of on the heels of this, and on the heels is the wrong way to say it, right? Because I think that, like, this work was the heartbeat that sort of, like, informed our work as, like, late 90s, just realizing that we were queer. And so I learned about ACT UP first through the musical Rent. And like, and Rent was like such an in point. I mean, that's complicated for a million other reasons that could have its own panel. But at the time, I loved that musical, and it was like my gateway to learning more about ACT UP and to learning more about the HIV/AIDS crisis. That was sort of like just, I mean, ending is not the correct way to say it, but that, like, the crisis itself was changing shape and changing form by that time. And to your question, Matt, about, like, the balance, it hit me because I think that I always believed that, like, in terms of politics, this was the way that, like, uprooting and turning things over and being in people's faces was the way and the only way. But personally, and to speak to your point on silence, Isabella, like, personally, in my personal life with my extended family members, I was mostly silent, and that has shifted drastically over the past, like, 5 years or so, in a way where I have realized that, you know, one informs the other. And I think that that's really important. And I think that that was a critical piece of ACT UP's message. It's just that for me, I had the privilege to sort of sit in what I thought was a comfortable silence for everyone. And it wasn't, is the truth. But I don't think there is a balance. I think that, like, fucking shit up is the only way at this point.
Yes, I agree. And that's so interesting because it's come back around again. You know, it's the same sort of thing with all the things that are going on in this country, you know, not talking about police brutality, not talking about economic injustice. Trans rights is a form of violence in itself, you know. And so speaking out and using whatever platform you have, even if it's as small as putting your pronouns in your profile, it's still, you know, an act. You're acting up, you know, like, even that. And I think that that's a really powerful lineage that ACT UP has left us with.
Yeah, it's like putting the BLM flag in your yard. Like, it's vulnerable. It can be hard to do if you're in a neighborhood where you've got terrible neighbors, but it's you're putting yourself out there in the same way that ACT UP was.
Yeah.
Let's move on to our next image. So this may look like, you know, a fairly, you know, innocuous, like, oh, wait, just a tennis racket. This tennis racket belonged to Martina Navratilova, a person who has kind of a mixed history with the queer community. So Martina, if you're not familiar, still is a major figure in professional tennis. In the early 80s, she did an interview with the New York Daily News, and she came out as, then she identified as bisexual. Later, she identified as a lesbian. Talked about her romantic past. She dated Rita Mae Brown, who's the author of Ruby Fruit Jungle. She was, and this was a huge deal at the time. She was rated #1 for many years, #1 women's tennis player in the world for years. And it cost her a lot. She said that she lost about $10 million in endorsements after she came out. She remained very active in politics and activism. She campaigned against Amendment 2 in Colorado, which was basically set the stage for the many years later decriminalization of homosexuality, the Supreme Court. And then she's also, you got this mixed history because in recent years, she's been really outspoken about the exclusion, about, she's in favor of excluding trans women from sports. She signed a letter just a few years ago, affirming that position. So, it's troubling on one hand to have a figure who seems like an ally and seems like, we're all on the same page. And then turns around and wants to exclude people. And, I think it's, it brings up a lot of mixed feelings to see this object. And I want to turn this to the panel. Like, what do we do about that? Like, how do you handle someone that you think of as an ally, but also holds a position that is counter to what, to basically where the moral arc of the universe is heading? Well,
just to drive home that I have Southern roots, as my grandmother used to say, not all kin are my kind. And that means that just because they are part of you, part of your community, your family, does not mean that they are always on your side. And people are complex, and people have complex issues, and they have complex feelings. And you can be very much a gay icon, a queer advocate, and also be transphobic. You can be trans and be transphobic. You can be Black and be racist. You can be gay and still be homophobic. God knows, we've all encountered those people. Like, it's just a thing, and I think it's very complex. I can give her flowers for what she did at the time, and I can tell her, like, that I can recognize that greatness in her and what she sacrificed. But at the same time, like, times are different, and there are things that she is wrong about. And as you were talking, Matt, I was thinking about how right now we have so many laws that are being enacted to exclude trans children from sports. And this idea of, I think it's Title IX, and how great Title IX was at the time, before all of this, where we were just like, this is great, this is going to help protect girls, and how that is being used to disenfranchise trans women. It's trans people. It's remarkable to me. It's so complex, our history, and it's full of idiosyncrasies a lot of the time.
Yeah, I'm always hopeful that the people in our community that have terrible points of view like this just come around with time and more education, and we're talking about it. Like, I'm put in mind as people like Randy Wicker, who was a Mattachine activist, and was later very transphobic towards Sylvia Rivera and would misgender her in his articles. And then over time, he slowly came around, and then Sylvia and Marsha P. Johnson both ended up being his roommates, and they became great friends. And nowadays he described himself as a former male chauvinist pig, his exact words. He had so many points of view that were wrong at the time. And now in his 80s, he's able to admit when things were wrong. And I know that is like a rare example of a person who lives long enough to know their mistakes. And hopefully she does too. And hopefully Caitlyn Jenner does too.
Ooh. That's all I was thinking about when you were both talking. But I love giving her flowers. That's such a beautiful way of putting it, that like there is acknowledgement that is deserved there. But the truth of it is that I think, like, if you are in one or many ways a part of a marginalized community, you have a bit more access perhaps to understanding that everyone's perspective is not your own, and to listening, but it's not a guarantee. And so, I think there are some people who will continue learning and continue listening, and some people who were there to advocate for their way of living because they understood their way of living, and they couldn't get past that, or they can't get past that. And so, you know, I'm always an advocate of like giving the information, having the conversation, and then if there's not a response, and if there's not positive movement, your energy is better used elsewhere. And now I'm adding to that, and they can still keep their flowers.
Yeah, you can recognize it. It's the same thing for Caitlin, right? It's like, Caitlin, like, good job and everything like that. I wish you would have several seats, but I can still recognize, you know, the work. And our community is not a monolith. The community is not coming from the same economic, socioeconomic backgrounds. We're not all coming from the same racial backgrounds. And there are so many intersectional issues inside of the community, and transphobia has been one of the biggest ones. I think transphobia inside of the queer community has been an issue for a very long time, but because of the fact that we were so focused for so long on trying to live, we really couldn't even focus on cleaning our own houses for a really long time. We just wanted to have houses for a really long time, you know? And now that we've sort of gotten past that, we can sort of look around and be like, actually, we are living in filth and we need to figure this out soon. And I think that this is one of the complex issues that we could only really talk about once we were sort of past the threshold, which Maria helped us to get past, of being able to even be visible and to even live. And so now we got to go deeper, you know, and I will give her credit for that.
Well, there is so much more to say about all of these artifacts, and we've only just scratched the surface of the conversations that could be had about every single one of these images. And fortunately, a fantastic place to continue those conversations is at MoPOP here in Seattle at the exhibit Rise Up Stonewall and the LGBTQ Rights Movement. It's going to be at MoPOP until September, presented in partnership with the Freedom Forum. So I do urge everybody to go check out that exhibit over at MoPOP. And a huge thanks to MoPOP for hosting this panel and for making this conversation possible. So I want to go around and just ask everybody where folks can find you. Let's start with Kristin.
Well, you can find me on social media, fortunately or unfortunately for me. My handle is Kristin Nolene, and you can find the work that I do with LGBTQ communities using that. I'm going to spell it for you because nobody knows how to spell Nolene. It's KRISTIN Noeline. And I also host a Buffy the Vampire Slayer podcast called Buffering the Vampire Slayer, which is really queer and really patriarchy smashing. So come on over and hang out.
Fantastic. Good. Doing great work. Devlyn, how about you? Where can folks find you?
You can find me mostly on Instagram at Queer Serial. It's serial with an S. My podcast is the serialized history of queer liberation in America from the beginning of the 1920s all the way through the year following Stonewall. And right now I'm releasing the third and final season. So you'll hear some of like the biggest pickets and riots and Stonewall and a lot of really big events. And I post a lot of images from those things on Instagram at Queer Serial.
Fantastic. I'm a big fan of that podcast, and not just because I was briefly on it. So thanks for joining us.
2 episodes, he's fab.
Thank you. And Isabella, where can folks find you online?
You can find me online at Izzy Von Ghoul on Twitter and Isabella Von Ghoul on Instagram. I also have a monthly series at the Langston Center where we discuss films and Black media and how Black media impacts the representation that Black people experience in real life. And I'm also one of the curators for the SIF programming as well. So yeah, those are the places that you can find me.
Awesome. Yes. And with any luck, we will be back to having in-person events soon because I really enjoy the screenings that you host.
Oh, thanks, man.
And I've been Matt Baum. You can find me online at my website, mattbaum.com, where I got a little newsletter about all the stuff that I'm working on. You can also check me out on YouTube, where I do a video series about queer episodes of television. Just posted a video. Oh, goodness. I've had a bunch about Friends, about The Nanny. I'm working on one about queer animation of the 90s right now. So that's been an adventure. So check that out at youtube.com/mattbaum or my website, mattbaum.com. And if you're in Seattle and you like knowing what's going on, check me out on The Stranger. I cover the queer beat for The Stranger and also geeks and with increasing frequency, the furry fandom. So check out all 3 of those interests intersecting over at The Stranger. Want to send a big thank you to MoPOP for hosting this panel and to Seattle Pride for making this possible. Big thanks also to the Freedom Forum for putting together the exhibit that we've been talking about. And to everybody who is a part of this panel and everybody who's watching, thanks so much for joining, and we will see you out in the streets.